In this lesson, we're going to be looking at solving a problem using the Composition API. When we have two components that each do API calls, there's a bunch of extra code that usually you need to write around these API calls, which usually are promises, because you need to check for when it's loading or not loading or done loading, and if there's any errors that pop up. So usually what you end up doing in your code is creating another file that encapsulates this behavior. In our case, we'll be moving some of that shared code into a file called usePromise in our composables directory. This will be more clear in our code example, so let's dive into it. Here we have a single component which has a search input, and for now we're just printing out the loading status, the error status, and the number of events that match this search input. Notice we're not actually returning the results, just the number of results. In the browser, this is what this template is going to look like. Further down in the file, we can see that we're importing using our Composition API. So we're in View 2 using the Composition API plugin. We're also using this dummy event API file, which we don't need to read. Then we have inside of our setup method, our reactive references for our search input, our results, our loading, and our error state. And they each have an initial value. Next, we have our load data asynchronous function, which is called whenever our search input changes. First, we set loading to true. We reset the error and results values. Then we do our API call, and on return, we set the result value. Any errors are caught, and then finally, we set loading value equal to false. Now we have a little bit of code to write. We want to watch our search input, and when it changes, first we check to see if our value is not empty. If it's not empty, we'll go ahead and call load data with our search input value. Otherwise, if our search input is empty, we'll set the results to null. And lastly, we need to return the items that our template needs access to. If we jump into the browser, we can see that as we type into the search field, loading gets toggled, and the number of events gets returned. This works great, but let's modularize the code around our API call so that we can reuse this in other components. To do this, first, I'm going to copy some of the code in our component. Then I'm going to delete this code except for the API call, which is specific to this component. Then I'm going to jump into the usePromise.js file, which I just created. Inside the file, I'm going to import from the Composition API, and then I'll create a function called usePromise, which receives the function to call with async await, basically our API call. I pasted our code here, but it needs some modifications. First, we're going to create a constant called createPromise, which will contain an asynchronous anonymous function which receives any arguments that our API call needs. Then instead of doing the API call here, this is where we call the function we passed in earlier with the arguments we send in. In our case, we'll have a single argument, which is the value of the search input. Lastly, we'll return results, loading, error, as well as our createPromise function. Now, back inside of our app.view, we can import the usePromise function. Then we'll create a new constant called getEvents, which calls usePromise. It has a single parameter, which is search. Then we'll execute the API call specific to this component to get our event count, sending in our search value. Then inside of watch, now when the search input changes, we need to call getEvents.createPromise, sending in our search input. Our results are now inside getEvents if we need to reset them. And lastly, results, error, and loading can be destructured from the getEvents object. Now if I jump into the browser, I can see that everything is still working, except now my code is more reusable. When I showed this code to two different members of the Vue core team, they wanted me to make a change. They basically said, hey, you should keep the return values namespaced under the object getEvents. don't destructure it. If I did this, the code would change to look like this, where I have getEvents dot, getEvents dot, getEvents dot. Now the data is a little more encapsulated and it's clear where it's coming from. However, if we look in the browser, we can see that it's not working. Vue isn't recognizing that these are reactive references and calling .value on them. To fix this, in Vue 2 using the composition API, we could just call .value on each of those items in the template. And that would be the solution here. However, I did want to validate if this worked or didn't work in Vue 3. So I fired up some code in Vue 3, and sure enough, this code would work as expected with Vue 3. You wouldn't have to call .value. It would recognize them as reactive references. So it seems to be a bug in the composition API plugin for Vue 2. Congratulations, you got to the end of the Vue 3 Essentials course. I am now going to go work on the Vue 3 Reactivity course, which by the time you're watching this may or may not be available. So either go and do it or keep an eye out for it. One or the other. And again, thanks for getting through the course.